Hello there, sword friends. This is going to be part 2 of the review of the Magnificent Chu Jian by LK Chen. In this video, I'm going to focus more on the usage side of things. Part 1, I focused on the build quality, gave you some high-res video photos of the build quality and you know, kind of end-to-end on the sword. This is going to be a little bit more focused on the usage. So do bear that in mind if you haven't checked out Part 1. It's linked in the description down below if you're interested in hearing me babble on for 30 minutes about the build quality on the Magnificent Chu Jian. Also some notes. I got this as a review sample from LK Chen. If you think that makes me biased, you know kind of at the start. I don't study Chinese swordsmanship as well. I did actually bring this on a field trip to somebody that does study Chinese swordsmanship, so you'll get to see it move around. I'll put their info in the description down below. Sifu Voss was very gracious with his time, moved this around, and he studies at the School of Shaolin Kung Fu in Coon Rapids, Minnesota. If you're local to the area, you should go and check them out. The other bit to know is that in Part 1 I said I would break the sword. I said that I would destroy it, and I didn't do that. LK Chen 1 asked me not to break the sword, which I was pretty happy to agree to. One, because it's a handy visual aid. I don't own any other Jian at this point. I've destroyed all the other ones. So it's nice to have as a visual aid, but also I really like the sword. It's a very fun piece to have in the hand. I did abuse it in this testing, if you want to call it that. I didn't intentionally break it though, so there's a distinction there. You'll see the abuse that I put in. It didn't survive it unscathed, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Last bit to note is that this is a $408 sword on Kult of Athena. It was $370 last time I checked on LK Chen's website, so that's kind of the frame of mind as I think about if it's worth it or not. I do want to talk first about the field trip that I took with the sword to the School of Shaolin Kung Fu in Coon Rapids, Minnesota. Again, if you're interested, their information is linked in the description down below. If you're around the area, I would encourage you to check them out. They're a great group of folks and very gracious with their time. I do want to also point out that when I arrived, I'd never met Sifu Voss before. I called him up and said, hey, I'm a stranger on the internet that makes content about swords on YouTube. Can I bring this sharp sword that you've never handled before to your school? Can you give me an hour of your time, swing it around, tell me what you think, and then I'm going to put it on the internet for everyone to see. So no pressure, right? He was very gracious with his time. He didn't have a huge amount of feedback for me about the actual sword, but I did get to see him move it around, and I found the experience very, very interesting as well, especially about how I do reviews, to actually go to a school of people that aren't sword nerds about things, but just people that use swords. You'd think I'd know better at this point, but I guess I don't. Anyway, so you're seeing him move this sword around right now. And the basic gist in terms of feedback, one, he said that this sword was heavier than what he was used to. Now bear in mind that the Jian that he's using are dull kind of practice tools, and he was a little bit cautious with the sword as well, because this one is sharp. I've incidentally honed the edge a little bit with the ceramic rod on one side. I haven't sharpened it per se, which is something that I somewhat regret doing. I'll talk about that later in testing, but one side of the sword is razor sharp, right? And he's moving it around, and he's used to practicing primarily with dull swords. Not that he doesn't practice with sharp ones periodically, but the majority of his thousands of repetitions of forms that he's doing are with dull swords. So being cautious because you have a sharp sword in your hand, and two, that it's uncomfortable is different. But weight-wise is what I was trying to talk about, and that is that a lot of the swords are a little bit shorter, thinner, maybe a little bit more flexible, maybe made of aluminum, and they feel quite a bit different in the hand. So I think of this as a light sword at 1 pound 10 ounces roughly. At a 31-inch blade, that is relatively light for its length, and just relatively light overall. But in contrast to the training tools that he was using, it was a little bit heavier. He was still able to move it around pretty dexterously and get comfortable with it quickly, which again I think is a testament to him as a practitioner, but also to the balance and maneuverability of this sword. He didn't find it to be cumbersome, just that you could immediately notice that it's a real sword and likely a little bit heavier than what he's used to using. The other bit that he noted was actually the grip, and that was that this sword has a grip that is different than what he's used to. And in looking at the Jian that are typically practiced with, it's one either round piece or mildly ovoid piece. And this has an ovoid section here, and then it tapers off to a round bit, and might be even a little bit on the shorter side than some of the other Jian that were there. So again, he got used to it and initially said it was different, and kind of threw him off a little bit to have this grip. But towards the end of the hour where he was practicing and I was filming and taking photos and stuff, he noted that he got used to it and came to like it a little bit. So that again is a mix of the same thing, both that as a practitioner he is able to adjust, but also if this is a grip that you're not used to as a practitioner, if you're using this for Chinese swordsmanship and this grip is different than the practice tool you're currently using, then it's something that obviously you could get used to. And I think that again, is a testament to this sword, its dynamic properties, how it feels, that it's a replica of a historic piece, and it blends in your hand pretty used to. It's pretty easy to get used to. So anyway, that was the bit of feedback. Hopefully the view of somebody more competent moving the sword around and practicing with it is helpful. He was very graceful with it, I thought, and doing maneuvers that I wouldn't have necessarily thought to do. I don't, again, study Chinese swordsmanship, but I did try to do some of the thrusting movements. I noticed that I'm not doing them particularly well, granted, but he's taking the tip is relatively high, maybe pointed at the opponent's face, and then going down and thrusting. I tried some of that, and I found that point control-wise, this sword is very, very easy to move around, and it was nice to see it move in more capable hands. Anyway, hopefully that's helpful to you. I'm going to talk now more about the actual usage of the sword, and it's worth noting that I went in somewhat reverse order for the lighter targets and started with a tatami mat. So that's what I began with. And in cutting with tatami, it would cut every time deadly. It would cut deep in. I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of one of those cuts, but it didn't ever cut in a way that I would describe as similar to a katana or really graceful, or giving me the cuts that I'm really going for, which are clean edges. I could get the edge where I wanted, but either my edge alignment's off, or the sword with its more obtuse edge angle and pronounced ridge and hollow grind don't lend itself to well, it's probably me, but I had trouble getting the kind of cuts that I was really looking for out of the sword. But each time it did cut into the tatami, and it would be deadly, and if I swung hard enough, then it would make it through the tatami. Otherwise, I would kind of scallop and move into it. I didn't find it to be a particularly great tatami cutter. When I moved to a different target, though, water bottles, this is where I had a little bit more success. It would cut through the water bottles. I fixed my stand, incidentally, so it's actually flat now, and some of the water bottle bases actually stayed on there, which was surprising, but I was able to get a couple good cuts. I also found that the tip control was pretty good, both on tatami and on the water bottles. I could deliver blows and actually get the tip where I wanted to, which is good, because I'm notoriously bad at that. But I found it to actually be a much more effective water bottle cutter than tatami cutter. I sailed through the bottles, and some of the glancing, harassing kind of cuts, I lost well, basically it didn't cut and it batted it off the stand. And I also did try with the water bottle cutting to strike into the actual cap, into the neck of the bottle where the plastic is thick, to see if it would damage the edge, and at no point did it damage the edge, really. I would say at this point, though, I started to lose some of that razor sharpness that I had from the ceramic stone, and that was reflected when I went to the pool noodle. I really had to throw it out there to get the blade to cut through the pool noodle, which I wouldn't have to do if it had a really keen edge. I think some of the glancing, harassing kind of cuts that I could do if I had taken this to a sander and given it a proper edge, it would have lasted, and I would have cut in the pool noodle better. I also got pretty lazy with my pool noodle cutting, frankly, and it didn't show the sword in particularly great light. But it can cut with more or less the factory edge at this point if I deliver enough chutzpah on the cut. Otherwise, it kind of smacks the pool noodle around. And that, I suppose, brings us to the actual part where I can talk about abuse. So now I'm bringing it into abusive territory. First, I started with some lighter branches and stuff like that, which debatably aren't abusive. But it's not really those lighter branches that I want to talk too much about. It's the log that I brought out. So there's a large branch, and this is dried hard wood at this point. And I started chopping through the branch. And I wasn't really trying to cut all the way through or see how well it cut in. I knew it wasn't going to cut through the branch. I was using this sword as an axe, and I just tried to deliver a lot of shock into the sword. Now I'm cutting with about 75% power. I'm delivering as much control as I can, but I don't have protective gear on, so I'm prepared for, you know, things to go awry. But I'm striking actually pretty hard, trying to give the sword opportunity to bend or something like that. And at no point did it. It eventually smashed through the log and held up and is still in overall good shape. But any semblance of the keen side or the ceramic work that I had done before was at this point gone. I then also took it and I threw it at the tree. And so this is where I started to notice some problems. Now, I hit it with the back of the sword here. It struck on the flat once, and once it stuck in and buried itself about, I don't know, 3 to 5 inches into the tree. It was kind of tough to get out. And it's an opportunity for the sword to bend. I was surprised that it didn't. There was no bending after throwing it at the tree. But there were some slight issues. One, this guard has the most minor bit of movement. It looks like there's a bit of like glue or residue or something like that in the guard that's sticking up a little bit more than it was, and I can move it. I can feel it move, but I can't hear it, and it doesn't really show particularly well on camera. What you might be able to hear is this. There's a slight rattle here, and I'm suspecting that this is because some adhesive or epoxy between the tang and the wood has come loose in a void in there, and that's what's rattling around on the tang, and that's what I'm hearing, because nothing else is loose. I can't rattle it around. If I twist my hands, I don't feel any movement whatsoever, so I think that's what's caused the rattle inside there. So anyway, that's the abuse that I've done up into that point. I threw it, and then eventually, after throwing it, I smacked it on the log, intentionally trying to bend it. And this is a recipe to get things to bend. Just strike hard against the flat. And I immediately saw that it was starting to curve a little bit. So it did take a bend there, which was surprising and disappointing. It didn't bend when throwing it at a tree, but intentionally trying to slap it on the side, I kind of expected it to spring back. It didn't. So a couple strikes on the opposite side, and it was right back to straight. But it would take a bend if I intentionally tried to bend it by striking the flat hard against a braced surface. Anyway, it didn't bend that much, but I would notice that it would start to bend. So from there, I brought it to a barrel. And now this is where I would say we're definitely in abusive territory. And first I started batoning it into a brass fitting. Now brass is a softer metal than steel, but in some cases that brass fitting has caused edge deflection, bending, things like that. So I first braced it, or just set the blade on the brass fitting and batoned it in with a piece of wood. And I couldn't even tell where I did that. It was tough for me to figure out in the camera where I did. So I backed it out and did several strikes into that brass fitting. And in some cases I was cutting the brass fitting a little bit, and I don't see any edge damage really from doing that. There's very, very minor areas where you can kind of tell where I hit it, but they are minor. I could sharpen them out. I would say that the edge damage is extremely small, especially for what I've done. Again, this has damaged swords in the past. It's a brass fitting, but it's a thick piece of brass, and it's braced on a steel barrel. So it held up really well, though. And so then I did a couple quick tip tests by striking or thrusting into the steel barrel, and maybe not even a millimeter or half a millimeter even of roll has happened on the tip. It's still a very effective tip, and I thrust reasonably hard into the steel barrel and it didn't roll. It's a pretty good reinforced tip that's on here. So it held up, I would say, really well. Those are abusive things, but that's as far as I wanted to push it. I didn't want to intentionally bring it to the croquet stick of doom and damage it. Obviously that would start to cause edge damage, but it has a similar obtuse angle to the Royal Arsenal, to the Double Dragon Sway Dao. It has a lot of similarity to the steel and things used in that. So I've kind of seen how it reacts. This one held up really, really well though. So anyway, overall, hopefully that helps. That striking into the barrel, incidentally, if there was problems in the hilt or was concerned about it coming apart, it had an opportunity to do it there and it didn't. It's held up pretty well. And any damage that's on here, at least on the blade, I could sharpen out. This little rattle is irritating, but not really anything more than that. It doesn't appear to be functional at all, and I'm not concerned that the sword is going to come out of the handle or anything like that. There's very other little complaint that I would have. Again, the cord wrap has started to look less graceful. It's moved in some places, but not substantially. And again, I used it, threw it at a tree. And I also want to point out that in the usage, there's something that I didn't notice, and that was a huge amount of shock while I was using the sword. As I noted, I'm striking with a lot of gusto into that branch. And then I struck into the barrel, and I didn't feel a lot of shock in my hand. I did feel vibration, but not a huge amount. And given that I was using it with the glove, it was actually reasonably comfortable to absorb and feel that much vibration in my hand. So it dynamically is not unkind to the user. I also want to point out that I didn't feel out of control in my hand. So it's wet, I'm in the mud, it's damp, and at all points this felt secure in my hand. If I hold this here and try to twist, it doesn't move around, and as I'm striking the sword, I didn't find myself having to constantly readjust and correct my grip because the sword had turned in my hand. So it absorbed some of those hard strikes as well. You can be elegant with the light sword, but if you want to deliver a hard blow, the sword is going to take that, and you'll still feel in control of the weapon. So there's one other note that I have that was more tied to review part 1, and that was the scabbard. You can see that it basically doesn't go in about the last inch of the sword. And what I found by taking this fitting off, it took a little persuasion to get off. I had to futz with it. I'm very confident I could thump somebody in the head with this in its original adhesive, and it wouldn't come off. So do bear that in mind. It was pretty secure, but I was able to get it off without breaking the scabbard, and I can just see that the tip isn't what's holding it in. It's binding somewhere up in here where the scabbard steps down and the blade starts to get thicker. So I think through this hole, because it's open at the end here, that I'd be able to get a file or some sort of something in there to remove some material and potentially get the sword to fit in all the way again. I don't know though, and I don't know that that's a common problem. I haven't heard a lot of people complain that their scabbard shrunk and now it's too tight to fit in all the way, but that's a problem that this one had. Otherwise, it survived pretty well. As I talk about it, the blade held up to some abusive stuff. I whacked into a brass fitting, and there's very little edge damage. It got a little bit of rattle in the handle. It's not a cosmetic issue exactly because you can't see it, but you can hear it. It's an audible thing, and it's irritating, but not functional. And the guard has the slightest wiggle if I put it under pressure, but I don't feel it in motion at all. And then the Ito, or not the Ito, the cord wrap has moved ever so slightly, but it's still pretty secure for how hard I was gripping it and moving it around. Anyway, so yeah, very little damage overall. I'm pretty happy with the overall performance. And that brings me to the part, do I personally think the sword is worth it or not? And it's a pretty easy yes for me. In part 1, I noted that this is very graceful and fun feeling in the hand. I like the way it feels for a longer blade. It's not as light and lively as the Royal Arsenal is. It doesn't immediately give you that same connection, but it's also much, much longer. And for how long it is and how maneuverable it feels. Also how cool it is with the hollow ground features. I really like that. The prominent central ridge, the kind of bolstered edges. I think it's just, there's so much cool happening here, and it's so fun to have in your hand, and it's also quite handsome, if I do say so. So all of those things combined, yes, I personally think it's fun. I really enjoyed the sword. I'm really grateful to LK Chen for sending it over, because I don't think initially it would have been a sword that I was drawn to. I don't generally buy Jian, but this would be something that I would definitely spend my own money on. I think it's a fantastic sword. If you're a practitioner of Chinese swordsmanship as well, do bear in mind that the handle may feel different, that it's heavier than some of the practice pieces, but it was something easy for a seasoned practitioner to get used to. So it gives me the impression that while it might be a little longer or proportionally a little different, that the dynamics of the sword are suited to somebody who practices swordsmanship. If you're looking for a sword to abuse as well, I didn't push this one all the way, but I have pushed other LK Chens made from this steel all the way. It held up really well. I'm actually particularly impressed that it didn't take any notable edge damage from whacking into the brass fitting pretty hard. I was kind of expecting it to. I was a little fast and loose with some of those strikes, and I really expected it to deflect. It didn't. It did take a bend while intentionally trying to bend it. Would have liked it if it didn't do that and it sprung back, but it seems like the steel is overall pretty robust and good. So yes, if you're looking for something maybe in the Chinese theme that's resilient, I think this is also one of those things. All right, sword friends, hopefully that is enough. I babbled on for 20 minutes in part 1, and however this one is in part 2. Hopefully you have the information you need to decide if the sword is worth your money or not. To me, it's a yes, but to you, hopefully the video and information helps. Anyway, if you have comments, questions, throw them down below. Let me know. Special thanks again to LK Chen for sending the review sample. That's all I've got. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.